In the last lesson, we learned about the plugin lifecycle, how Sublime loads and unloads plugins, and that most parts of the API aren't available to us until our plugin is officially loaded for the first time. Today, we're going to dip our toes into the plugin development pool a little bit by learning how we can allow our plugins to introspect information about the copy of Sublime that they're currently running inside of. Now, this isn't something you need to do on a regular basis, but it does come up from time to time, so it's good to know how to do it for when those needs arise. And it is an excellent real world example about why we need to pay careful attention to the plugin lifecycle in Sublime. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. Odette Nerd here. Welcome back to Plugin 101, where the topic of this week's lesson is getting platform information in our plugins in Sublime Text. Now, what exactly do we mean by platform information? Simply just information about Sublime Text itself, like whether it's running on Windows, macOS, or Linux, or whether it's a 32-bit version or 64-bit version of itself, even what version of Sublime it actually is, or core information about Sublime, like where it stores its packages. Now, this is something that you generally don't need while you're creating plugins inside of Sublime Text. Sublime, its API, and the Python programming language used to create plugins are all designed to work the same across all of the three platforms. So as long as you're writing valid Python code, you're writing code that will work in a plugin on any platform, no matter where your plugin happens to be running. But there are certain cases where you need to know information about the copy of Sublime that you're running inside of in order to take appropriate action. So it's good to know how to do this sort of thing. And it is an excellent object lesson in the plugin lifecycle and why it's so important and why we need to pay attention to it. So let's give some examples of why we might want information of this particular nature. Now, Python can access native compiled libraries for speed, but in order to do that, it needs to be able to load a library that's appropriate for the operating system that you're on, Windows, Mac OS, or Linux, and it needs to know whether it's 32-bit or 64-bit to make sure the correct library would be loaded. So we need access to that information if that's something we needed to do inside of our plugins. We may need to know where Sublime stores its actual package files because perhaps our package ships with some sort of script or tool that needs to be executed by something externally, and we need to be able to tell exactly where that is located. And there are multiple versions of Sublime. As Sublime goes on, it gets more features. So it's possible you may want to create a plugin that has additional features for people that are running newer versions to take advantage of newer capabilities, or maybe determine that you're running on an older version and work around for people that haven't managed to upgrade yet. So these are all just some simple examples of why you might actually want this sort of information in the first place. And where might we find this sort of information? For that, we probably want to check out the API documentation. Here we're going to be using Snappy. You could also refer to this in the web page. And the first thing we might say is, well, we want to know what version of Sublime we are running inside of. So if we were to do a search, we could search for version, and it turns out sublime.version has us covered. In fact, this is going to tell us 3 or 4 things that we might be interested in just right here. Now, this Sublime module is something that is, of course, ships with Sublime. Everybody that has a copy of Sublime has it. And as we'll see in just a moment, when we look at plugin code, the default stub plugins automatically include this library for you. So it's just always available. Now, this library, this module contains a large number of endpoints, which we're going to go into eventually, but not here in this video. But we can see here, we could use sublime.version to get the version number of Sublime, or sublime.platform to get the platform that Sublime is running on. We could use sublime.arch to determine whether this is a 32-bit or 64-bit version of Sublime Text. And we could even determine whether our build is a stable build or a development build if we cared about that sort of thing. Now, remember, when it comes to writing plugins, a nice thing to keep track of is the console, where it is a direct window, if you will, into the innards of the Sublime Text plugin system. And it's also worth noting that because this is meant to be used as a console for plugins, the Sublime module and the Sublime plugin module, which we'll cover in a future video, are automatically included loaded here inside of the console. So we can execute arbitrary plugin code like sublime.version and see that I'm running Sublime Text version 3211. Or we could check to see what platform I'm on if we didn't recognize it, and we could see that I'm running on Windows. And of course, we could throw Arch in here to see that I'm running a 64-bit version of this. And just because it's available here, we could run Channel as well and see that this is a stable build. So with these 4 calls, we could see that I am running a stable build of Sublime Text build 3211. That's the 64-bit build on Windows. And that gives us a fair bit of information. Other information that we were interested in was knowing where Sublime Text stores its packages. And that is available in here as well. We're not going to look it up there. But if we use sublime.packages path like so, we would see the exact place where the packages folder is for my particular copy of Sublime running right now as me. And this is the same folder that you would see opened if you use Preferences, Browse Packages from the menu or from the command palette. So in all of those things that we talked about, for examples, knowing whether we are on Windows or Linux or 32-bit or 64-bit or where packages are stored, these methods give us access to this very information. Now, let's go ahead and look at a plugin, and we'll just go ahead and pull in the lifecycle plugin that we used in the previous video. And remember, when we save this plugin, we can see down there in the console with that, the plugin says that it just got unloaded, then it says hello, then it says my plugin just loaded. And if you're unfamiliar about why it's saying these things in this order, we're going to cover that here, but there's also the previous lesson that you could refer to. Now we're going to go ahead and jump back up to here and replace this line of code with some code that I prepared earlier, which is this. So this is going to tell us the version, the platform, the architecture, and the channel. And furthermore, we could add in some extra information here. We could say whether we're at the path for unpacked packages, which is the packages path we just saw, or even the installed packages path, because that's also available by a similar method. Remember, you can always check the documentation for that sort of thing. So if I was to save this file, we can see it printing right down in here the version of Sublime, the platform, the architecture, the channel, and those 2 package folders. So this is an example of us actually doing this inside of a plugin. Now remember, Sublime loads plugins by loading up the file and then executing the code from the top down that sets up any classes. For example, the example command that we can see on line 19 in this file, that gives it the information it needs to know what this plugin provides. Once that's done, it calls plugin loaded to tell us that our plugin has been officially loaded and we're good to go. And of course, when Sublime is unloading our plugin, which it would do if the package the plugin was in was added to the list of ignored packages, or it's about to reload it because it detects that it's changed, the plugin unloaded would get called as well. Now, these are very important things because remember we said in the previous video that most of the Sublime Text API is not available to you until your plugin is officially loaded for the first time when Sublime Text starts up, because Sublime launches the plugin host as an external task whose job it is to load all of the plugins. And once everything is all set up and the communication channel between the Sublime Text core and the plugin host is fully established, that's the point where the console prints the message that says plugins loaded, and then the plugin loaded method for all loaded plugins is executed if it exists. So until plugin loaded is called, then we don't have access to a large part of the API that is available to us. But here we can see that I'm doing it outside of plugin loaded and it's still working. This is something that can really catch you unawares. I'm going to go ahead and save that here because this seems to work just fine. However, if we were to go up to here and exit Sublime entirely and then restart it like so, I'm going to go ahead and open the console here. Now we're going to see right here that it said it's reloading the plugin user.lifecycle. As it's doing that, it executes the code. We can see it printing the version, the platform, the architecture, and the channel. But now the unpacked and installed package folders are empty strings, even though a moment ago they were actual paths. And we follow down here. Here's the line that says plugins loaded, which is the official indication that the communication channel between the plugin host and Sublime has been fully established. And we get it saying my plugin just loaded because that's when plugin loaded is actually called. So this code was executed to load the plugin, but it didn't quite work for us. However, if we were to save the plugin again, now spontaneously it is working. And this is one of those things that is the plugin lifecycle, why you have to pay attention to it, and it can really catch you unawares if you're not careful. But if we were to jump back to the Sublime Text documentation and look in the entry for the plugin lifecycle, it very specifically says, let's go ahead and read it together. At importing time, plugins may not call any API functions with the exception of Sublime version, Sublime platform, Sublime Arch, and Sublime channel. And then it goes on to say that if there's a module level function plugin loaded, that'll be called when the API is ready. This is what that is talking about until the connection and communication channel between the plugin host and Sublime Text is fully established. Most of the API, everything except these methods here, basically will do absolutely nothing. And that's because the plugin host needs to be able to talk to the core of Sublime to know where it's storing things. The plugin host doesn't have access to that information, for example. And that holds for everything you see in the API documentation. So to solve our problem, we could move this file down here like so into the plugin loaded. Now, of course, the first four of these, the version, the platform, the architecture, the channel, those are all ones that will work anywhere in your plugin. And that's to allow you to determine what classes your plugin actually provides or what libraries it loads. You need to know that at load time, not at the point where all the code has already been loaded. So I'm going to save that. We come down to the console. We can see it says my plugin just got unloaded. My plugin just got loaded, and there's the information. Now I'm going to go ahead and come back up into here again and exit Sublime. And one more time, let's restart that. And when we come into the console, here now the message about the plugin just got loaded happens after the plugins loaded line because now it's actually doing it in the correct order, and we can see our calls work absolutely perfectly. To recap what we learned in today's lesson, Sublime Text can run across multiple different operating systems and multiple different architectures, but its API and the Python programming language used to create plugins are designed to behave the same across all of those platforms, so we really don't need to worry about that while we're creating plugins. If, however, we need to know that sort of information for whatever reason, the Sublime Text API can give us that information, but we must remember to respect the plugin lifecycle because if we try to call API methods too soon in our code, it will not work. And as we saw again, as a recap in the video, that can lead to weird problems where while you're working on your plugin, it works, but on a fresh start of Sublime, it doesn't work. So you need to be very, very careful indeed about how you access the Sublime Text API. But that is going to do it for this particular lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to be diving into the nuts and bolts of the terminology that we hear in our plugins, things like windows and views and selections and regions and points, what all of those things actually mean. So if you would like to be notified of that, make sure you use those buttons down below to thumb, subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate so you do not miss the next lesson when it drops. And until that next lesson, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.